When we talk about World War II in Europe, it's easy to get lost in the blitzkriegs, the epic battles, and the constantly shifting alliances. But before we get into all of that, before we look at the maps and the timelines, we have to start with the one thing that overshadows everything else, the unbelievable human cost of it all.
39 million. Just try to wrap your head around that number for a second. That's the minimum estimated number of people who died in the European theater alone. It's a number so huge it's almost meaningless, but it's the gut-wrenching backdrop to every strategy, every battle, and every decision we're about to discuss. So let's start there.
All right, so to really get a handle on a conflict this massive, we first need to set the stage. Who were the main players? And what do we even mean when we say the European theater?
At its core, the war was a clash between two massive alliances. On one side, you had the Axis powers, with Germany and Italy right at the center, aiming to just completely dominate the continent. And standing against them were the Allied powers, a coalition that eventually grew to include the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and of course, the United States. A truly global force.
And this vast area of conflict, well, that's what we call the European theater. It all kicked off on September 1st, 1939, with the invasion of Poland, and it didn't stop until Germany's final surrender on May 8th, 1945. That's nearly 6 years of non-stop war that just tore the continent apart.
So in the early days of the war, things looked really bad for the Allies. For the first couple of years, it honestly seemed like nothing could stop the Axis powers as they just rolled across Europe, pushing the entire continent right to the edge.
Germany's strategy of blitzkrieg, or lightning war, was something new and absolutely terrifying, and man, was it effective. Poland fell in just a few weeks. Then in 1940, it was one after another: Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and then, incredibly, France. All of them fell with shocking speed.
Just think about that. By the middle of 1941, the Axis controlled pretty much everything from the coast of France all the way to the Soviet border. The United Kingdom was basically the last one standing. For the Allies, the situation wasn't just bad, it felt pretty hopeless.
But just when it seemed like the Axis was unbeatable, the entire nature of the war began to change. A couple of massive events in 1941 were about to blow the conflict wide open and, believe it or not, plant the seeds for the Axis' ultimate defeat.
It really came down to two pivotal, game-changing moments. First, Germany's disastrous decision to invade the Soviet Union. This opened up a vast and incredibly brutal Eastern Front. Then, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor brought the full industrial might of the United States into the war. Those two decisions completely flipped the script.
And the impact of America entering the war was just staggering. Look at these numbers. In less than a year, the number of U.S. troops in Europe more than doubled, going from 1.5 million to over 3 million. This wasn't just about more soldiers. It was a tidal wave of resources and industrial power that the Allies desperately needed. It was a total game changer.
Meanwhile, over on the Eastern Front, the Battle of Stalingrad was an absolute meat grinder. The German defeat there wasn't just a loss, it was a catastrophic turning point. It completely shattered the myth of German invincibility and kicked off a relentless Soviet advance that wouldn't stop until it reached the streets of Berlin.
Okay, so the tide has officially turned. The Axis is on the defensive. Now, it was time for the Allies to launch their final all-out push. They started a coordinated squeeze from both the West and the East, designed to just crush the German war machine for good.
The big push from the West started with a name we all know, Operation Overlord. This was D-Day, June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in the history of the world. Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, finally opening that critical second front and beginning the long, hard road of liberating Western Europe.
And after breaking out in Normandy, it was just one brutal campaign after another. They fought their way across France, hit a wall of fierce resistance in the Rhineland, and even had to beat back a last-ditch German counterattack in the Ardennes. But every single victory got them one step closer to Germany itself.
And you have to remember, while all of this is happening in the West, the Soviet Red Army is doing the exact same thing from the East. They're launching this enormous offensive, liberating Eastern Europe, and just driving relentlessly, day by day, closer and closer to Berlin. The noose was tightening.
Trapped in this massive vice grip between two advancing armies, the German war machine finally crumbled. On May 8, 1945, VE Day, Germany surrendered unconditionally. And just like that,
After years of unimaginable brutality, the guns in Europe fell silent.
But the end of the fighting doesn't mean the end of the story, not by a long shot. Because the true cost of this war isn't just measured in military victories, but in the devastating loss of civilian life. Let's just take a moment to look at the numbers from just a few of the nations involved. In Germany alone, over 900,000 civilians died. This includes people killed in Allied bombing raids, but also countless victims of the Nazi regime's own horrific atrocities.
In France, the number is nearly 400,000 civilians. These were victims of the occupation, members of the resistance, and tens of thousands of French Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust.
The Netherlands, a relatively small country, suffered an enormous toll, over 187,000 civilian deaths, and a huge portion of that number, over 100,000, were Dutch Jews murdered during the occupation. And in Great Britain, over 67,000 civilians were killed, most of them during relentless German bombing campaigns like the Blitz, which got the terror of the war directly to their cities.
This quote really sums up the military end of it all perfectly. It was a combination of liberation and invasion, all leading to the final fall of Berlin and that unconditional surrender. It captures the finality of it all.
So, we've looked at the numbers, the dates, the campaigns. They help us understand the what and the how. But when you step back and think about the sheer scale of the destruction and the staggering loss of life we just touched on, you're left with this one question that just echoes through history. The war was won, sure, but how do you even begin to measure the cost?